gonna give you a tutorial about how to build a PC. You may ask, but why build it yourself? You can just buy one on the internet. Well, yeah, you could, but you may not get a good deal by buying it on in the internet. You can get a good processor, but not a good graphics card, so you may get things better if you do it yourself. Now let's talk about the components, like the CPU. You can choose two sides between Intel and AMD. Nowadays, AMD is the best processors that you can get. Okay. Now, graphics card between NVIDIA and Radeon. RAM that also it's completely random, like you can get Corsairs or anything else. Like just you have to notice between the speed and the capacity of the slot of RAM. Between more capacity, it will be more expensive. Now the motherboard is, you have to, if you choose an Intel or AMD processor, they could change the chipset, so you have to look at that. And also the size between ATX, it's the biggest motherboard size, micro ATX like a medium, and mini ATX, like it's between sizes of cases or and less. Now SSD, like there is also you have to choose between memory and capacity. You need, maybe if you want the best speed for opening an application in your PC, you should get a M2 SSD, because those have the best speed on today. And capacity could be that real expensive to get a nice speed and nice capacity SSD. And now the case. The case could be an full ATX. That is the biggest size of in a case. An ATX, it's less bigger than that, but kinda you can put all the types of motherboard. The mini ATX, I don't know why it's more less size than ATX. It's just smaller. And micro ATX for micro ATX motherboards.
So it is time to actually build our PC. So a big reason why I chose to go with this case is because it is so wide open on the inside. So even though the motherboard won't even fill the entire thing up, it's really easy to run cables behind the back of the motherboard, and specifically our power supply has a nice little basement to live inside. So all of this might look complicated and confusing, however, it's actually not that bad. So let me walk you through a couple of the power connectors that we're going to be using for this build. So if you look for the really big fat guy, this is the 20+4 pin. This goes into our motherboard. Every single PC build is going to need one of these, right? Next up, we have our CPU power. So this is a 4+4 pin. Most of the time, you're going to want to put these together, and this also will go into the motherboard. But for some boards, you may only need the 4 pin, and that's why it breaks apart. You can see it has a little clip on it, so it only goes in one way. If you're building a gaming PC, the next connector is something you're almost certainly going to need, and that is the PCI power. Now this is a 6+2 pin. So again, depending on your graphics card, it may need 6, it may need the full 8, and in many cases, you're actually going to need multiple of these. If you look inside your power supply box, you should find 4 tiny little screws. Now this is all we need to use to actually mount the power supply. Now one tip, this is good for PC building, but it actually applies to a lot of things, is to use a cross pattern on your screws. So don't do it super tight, and then instead of just sort of going around in a circle, now that we've got our top left end, we're next going to screw the bottom right. The reason why you use a cross pattern when you're installing power supplies or really any kind of PC component is it applies even pressure. So if you do like the left side first, the entire supply might actually be slightly misaligned. And this is actually just good general advice. If you're putting on like a car tire, you should use a cross pattern. You shouldn't just go kind of like around in a circle. Before we start building with the motherboard, let me give you a brief tour of what's going on here, because at first glance, well, there's a lot of stuff. So, number one thing to pay attention to is this. This is the CPU socket. It is slightly different between AMD and Intel, but regardless, you just drop your CPU in here, and I'll explain that in just a second. Now, to the right of that are our memory channels. So these are our DIMM slots, as the kids call them these days, the RAM DIMMs, the DIMM. So it's really straightforward. Open up the little slots, and this is where we'll be installing our memory. To the right of this is our power connector. So this is that 20+4 pin, the really big guy. That's where that gets plugged in. And if you look on top of the CPU socket, this is the 8-pin power supply. So again, from the actual power supply, you're plugging two things in here, the 20+4 pin and the 8-pin. That's it. This is our PCI slot. This is where you will install your graphics card. Now, you actually have a couple of other slots, and generally speaking, you can use these for things such as, if you're doing a really crazy build, multiple graphics cards, but usually you'll plug in things like, a capture card or maybe like a Wi-Fi card or something in here. The next thing to pay attention to is our M2 slot. Now, depending on the motherboard, you may have multiple of these. Sometimes they're actually on the back or like underneath some kind of cover. This one's thankfully right in the middle. And this is where you will install your M2 NVMe SSD. The one thing to pay attention to though are these little screws right here. So you'll see 2242, 2260, 2280, and 22110. Now, based on what size your SSD is, it's almost always a 2280. You'll want to plug in a screw or screw in a screw into one of these holes, and that screw will come with the motherboard. So that's the only thing that kind of gets a little confusing, because you definitely need that screw to keep it in, otherwise it falls out, and then you don't have an SSD. So the thing I want to focus on first is our processor. AMD's actually done a good job recently of shipping pretty solid coolers in the box, and especially considering that this entire setup is not particularly expensive, it actually makes a lot of sense for a semi-budget build. So you can see it's a fairly beefy heatsink. Now, one thing I will say is on the bottom of any of these coolers, AMD, Intel, whatever the case is, they will have pre-applied thermal paste. This is great. We don't have to deal with any sort of tubes or whatever. We can just drop this right on. However, don't touch this. When it comes to a processor, this is actually one of the more fragile components of the build. So generally speaking, grab it by the sides and do not, under any circumstances, touch these tiny little gold pins on the bottom. Now, because it's an AMD processor, it has a lot of these pins, and if you bend any of these, it could very easily kill the CPU. So all we do is lift up the little metal retention arm. You'll see the entire socket moves back. So take our processor, there's a tiny, tiny little gold arrow, which has a corresponding little notch on the actual socket. All we do is line it up. Again, do not force it, just gently rest it down. And look at that. Our CPU is installed. Push the little arm down. Done. Simple, right? Now, we just need to toss on our cooler, which actually should be pretty straightforward. This cooler is very easy to install. So all we need to do, again, try not to touch that thermal paste, is just line it up with the screw holes that we have right here. It should just rest right into place. And with that, then we'll just start screwing it in. Now, another reason why you want to make sure that you're applying even pressure is because we want to make sure that thermal paste on the actual CPU is making a nice, solid, firm attachment. So you'll see that there's a little cable that is attached to the fan. So this is a 4-pin header. Now, there usually will be pretty close. So for example, ours is right here, a little CPU fan header. Now, it's really easy to install. You'll see that there are a couple of notches here. So it means it only goes in one way. And all you need to do is just line it up and drop it right into place. When it comes to installing RAM, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. So because this is DDR4, you'll see that there's a little notch in the middle, and the entire thing is actually slightly curved. So that means that you're only going to be able to put it in one way. Line that notch up with the corresponding notch on the motherboard. If you try to put it down and it's not going in, you're probably doing it backwards. See here that we have 4 DIMM slots, which is the standard. So we have these 2 black, so it's 1 and 3, and then we have these 2 gray, which are 2 and 4. Drop it in the slot. And then 3, 2, 1, push, and there is our RAM install. So installing this SSD is very straightforward, but essentially what we need to do is install the little, what would you call it? It's like let's call it like the nub, like the little screw guy. So because this is a 2280 SSD, the vast majority of SSDs that you will be using are 2280. we just install this finger tight. So we screw it in. There we go. And now, to install the SSD, it's literally gonna take us like 3 seconds. So we line it up with the little slot. So I usually put it in with a little bit of an angle, kind of work it in to make sure it actually slides. So there we go. The next step is to take our SSD screw out, and then just literally lean it down, use the little screw to screw it into place to make sure it doesn't pop out of the socket. And oh look, we installed our SSD in literally like 18 seconds. That's it. So now it is time to bring back our case, and now we have to just install the motherboard. So if I flip this guy over, what you'll see is there are a series of little brass standoffs. So these are painted black, sometimes they're actually gold. But you can see there's standoffs on the top. There are also some standoffs in the middle, and especially this NZXT case has a little post here. This is really nice because it'll help us line it up. There are also some standoffs on the bottom. The important thing here to know is that it's actually very straightforward to install this. The only thing we need to do before actually installing the motherboard is put in our I/O shield. So now, all we need to do is put our motherboard into our case. Now again, because I'm using this NZXT case, I've got that little post in the middle. So as long as I get it kind of roughly lined up, perfect, love it. And then if we can get it on the peg here, which we can, boom, look at that. Motherboard's in place. Surprise, surprise, the way to do this best, and I'm sure you can't see this at all on camera, is using the cross method. So just start with one corner, get it screwed in, then go to the next corner, and kind of work your way around to make sure that, again, you're applying even pressure. The next step is to install the graphics card, which we so helpfully have right behind the case. It's almost like I planned it out like that. Look at that. This is our PCI connector. So this is what will attach the graphics card to the motherboard, which will go into this slot right here. And then if we look around on the back side of the card, you'll see that we have a single 8-pin power connector. So all we need to do is just remove this little cover on the back. So we'll remove this little piece. And the next step is to remove these top 2 screws, which should be pretty easy. Now when it comes to installing a graphics card, this is a very difficult process, which is going to require a lot of concentration. I'm just kidding. You just literally line it up and push it in. It's really easy. So just line up with a slot, click it, boom, done. Look at that. Now I'll use my giant screwdriver to put this little PCI cover back in place. Okay, we have power to our peripherals and we have a successful post. We're pretty much good to go. So we can start cable managing, get this thing all sort of buttoned up, install a copy of Windows, and you've successfully built yourself a gaming PC.